savings feels like progress, but it's not the same as building wealth. Because if you're still living from paycheck to paycheck, nothing is actually changing. Hello friends, my name is Becky and welcome back to the channel. Today I want to talk about the patterns you start to notice when you look at people who slowly build wealth over time. Because when you really start paying attention to people's financial lives, and I'm not talking about the flashy internet version of money, but the real everyday version, something interesting starts to appear. The people who eventually become financially stable or even wealthy often don't look like the people trying the hardest to get rich. They're not constantly chasing opportunities. They are not jumping from one strategy into the next. And most of the time, what they're doing actually looks pretty boring from the outside. But when you start observing it over many years, you realize that there are certain movements that keep showing up again and again. Small patterns, small habits, small ways of thinking about money that slowly change the direction of someone's life. If this kind of thinking interests you, if you like looking at money growth in a more realistic way, instead of the usual get-rich-quick schemes online, then stay here with me for a moment. Subscribe to the channel and click the notification bell so you don't miss the next video. Because on this channel, we're not just talking about theories. We are going to look at real behavior, real numbers, and real examples so these ideas actually become something practical. So in this video, I want to walk you through 4 movements that build wealth. 4 things that people who gradually build wealth tend to do differently. And while none of them will sound revolutionary on their own, together, they start to explain why some financial lives slowly expand, while others seem to stay stuck in the same place. So let's start with movement 1. Income first. You can't build anything if nothing is coming in. Now, many of us, including myself for a very long time, think about money as one single stream. You work, you get paid, and that paycheck is basically the engine that runs your entire life. Every bill, every plan, every financial decision is connected to that one source of income. And as long as that stream keeps flowing, everything feels stable. But the moment something interrupts it, a job loss, a business slowdown, or just a difficult period, suddenly the entire system feels fragile. And when you think about it like that, it becomes clear why so many of us feel financially stressed. Even when they are technically doing the right thing, because if your whole financial life depends on one stream of money, then stability always feels temporary. What really caught my attention is that people who build wealth tend to move away from that model over time. Not necessarily overnight, but gradually they start building multiple flows of income instead of relying on just one. And when you see this in real life, the difference becomes very concrete. So let's imagine someone earning about $3,000 a month from their job. That is their entire financial engine. That money pays the rent, the groceries, the insurances, maybe childcare, or maybe a car payment. And at the end of the month, if they manage to put aside a little bit, maybe $100 or $200, they feel like they are doing the responsible thing, which they are. They are saving. They're being careful. They are doing exactly what most of us were taught to do. But if nothing changes 10 years later, the structure of their financial life will still look exactly the same. The same job, same single stream of income, and maybe a savings account that slowly grows over time. If they were consistently putting aside $200 every month, that's about $24,000 in savings over 10 years. Now, of course, the bank will add a little bit of interest, and let's be generous and say that the savings account earns around 2% a year. So after 10 years, that account might sit somewhere between $26,000 or $27,000. And that's not nothing, that's discipline and stability, but the structure itself hasn't evolved. And it's also very hard for that structure alone to create real financial momentum. So you're not really going to get there. Now, imagine another person starting in the exact same position. Same job, same $3,000 paycheck, same monthly expenses, but instead of relying on that one stream, they slowly begin adding small additional flows over time. They started co-housing and sharing their 2-bedroom apartment with a friend. Now that brings in about $500 a month. They also rent out their garage or storage space to their neighbor. That adds another $150 each month. And on top of that, they occasionally do freelance work or tutoring. That average out to be around $500 a month. Now, nothing dramatic happened. They didn't get rich overnight. They didn't double their working hours either. But their income streams now look very different. Instead of one fragile pipe that everything depends on, the $3,000 paycheck, money now enters their life from different directions. $3,000 from the job, $500 from co-housing, $500 from freelance work, and a little extra from renting out his garage. It became a little over $4,000 now. And here's where something important happens. If their living expenses remain roughly $2,800 a month, exactly the same as the first person, the one with a single paycheck still only has about $200 left to save each month. But the second person with the same lifestyle and the same original job suddenly has around $1,350 of surplus. Not because they became more frugal, not because they worked themselves into exhaustion either, but because their income stopped coming from only one direction. And that difference becomes enormous over time. After 10 years, the first person might have around $26,000 in savings, including the interest the bank paid, but the second person with that additional surplus could have accumulated well over $150,000 in the same time. It could actually be closer to $175,000. Same starting point, but a completely different financial structure. And that difference changes everything. Because once money starts entering your life from multiple directions, and once that surplus begins to grow, something new happens. The question is no longer just, how much can I save? The real question becomes, what happens to that money once it arrives? Because if you don't decide that, it will decide itself. It will get absorbed into your lifestyle, your expenses, your habits, and before you even realize it, you can be earning more but still feel exactly the same. Because more income without direction doesn't actually change your life. And that's where the second movement begins. Control your money. Because if you don't control your money, it will control you. And this is where things really start to shift. Because once money starts coming in from different directions, The problem is no longer only income. It's what happens to that income once it enters your life. Because what most people do, even when they earn more, is they stay in the exact same pattern. Money comes in, bills get paid, things get handled, and whatever is left kind of just disappears. Not in one go, of course, but slowly, bit by bit, through small decisions and habits, things that feel completely normal. And at the end of the month, there's this moment when you think, where did it all go? And that's not because you're irresponsible. It's because there was no structure. Money that doesn't have a direction will always get absorbed into your life. Your lifestyle adjusts, your spending expands, and suddenly more income doesn't feel like more freedom. It just feels like more pressure. And this is exactly why so many of us, even with multiple income streams, still feel financially stuck. Because nothing is actually being controlled. And this is where movement 2 begins. Control doesn't mean complete restriction. It doesn't mean cutting everything out or living extremely frugal. It means awareness. It means knowing exactly what comes in and what goes out. And most importantly, where your money is going before it's already gone. Because most of us look at their money after the month is over. But people who build something decide in advance. They sit down and they give every part of their income a role. This part is for living, rent, food, everything that keeps life running. This part is for stability, your buffer, your safety net. And this part is for growth. And that shift alone changes the whole game. Because now when money comes in, it doesn't just flow through your life, it gets directed. And let me give you a very real example. Imagine that person from our previous example who makes now a little over $4,000 a month, coming from multiple income streams. And instead of just letting that money flow, they actually sit down, maybe for the first time ever, and they look at everything. Not in a quick and a hurry, but properly. They go through their bank account and look at their fixed costs, rent, electricity, water, subscriptions, insurance, everything that comes back every single month, and they add it up. And for the first time, they actually see the number, not what they think it is, but what it really is. And then they move on to the next part. Groceries, going out, hobbies maybe, small expenses, the things that don't feel big but add up over time. And instead of just letting that happen, they decide a number. Not perfectly, but consciously. This is what I am going to spend on my variables. And suddenly the whole budget becomes clearer. Because now when the money comes in, it already has a place to go to. So instead of money comes in, things happen, and whatever is left gets saved, it becomes money comes in, fixed costs are covered, variable spending is already decided, and what remains is intentional. Because let's say that after all of that, if we go back to our example, our person that had $4,000 of multiple stream income and a $2,800 cost of living, he now has over $1,000 left. And because it was created on purpose, it can now be used on purpose. It's no longer going to slowly disappear in his lifestyle. And once you reach this point, the question changes again. It's no longer how much can I save this month? It becomes what do I do with this money so it starts something doing back for me? Because if that extra $1,000 just sits there in a savings account, nothing really changes. So what can we do for it to make a real difference? Movement 3. This is where the money starts working for you, because that extra $1,000 can now be used to build something. It can be invested. It can be placed into something that grows over time, something that produces its own income, even when you're not working. And this doesn't have to be complicated. It can be as simple as consistently putting money into long-term investments. Things that follow the market, that grow slowly but steadily over time. And now you're no longer only earning income, you are starting to build systems that generate money. Let's look at what that would actually mean. If we go back to our previous example, the person that ended up with over $1,000 of surplus, and let's say he ends up saving that money in a savings account. That's about $12,000 a year. After 10 years, that person has saved roughly about $144,000. And if we again add a bit of interest from the bank, maybe that savings account ends up somewhere at around $155,000. Now that's solid. That is some financial discipline. But something important is still missing. That money is mostly still sitting. Now imagine that same $1,000 being used differently. Instead of parking it permanently in a savings account, part of it starts being positioned into assets. For example, someone might decide that every month $500 goes into a broad market stock index fund. Historically, the average long-term return of the stock market has been around 7% per year after inflation. Now, that's not guaranteed every year, of course. Some years are higher, some years are lower, but over long periods, that number is a reasonable historical average. So if someone invests $500 a month at around 7%, after 10 years, that investment account could grow to roughly $85,000. And here's where it becomes interesting, because that $85,000 is not just money sitting there. It is money that now represents ownership in hundreds of companies that are producing value in the real economy. Those companies generate profits, and some of those profits get paid out as dividends, and the value of those businesses grow over time. In other words, the money that originally came from your work slowly starts producing income of its own. And that's a very different structure from simply storing money in the bank. Now let's push the example a little further. Imagine that the other $500 of surplus each month is slowly accumulated toward a larger asset. Maybe a down payment for a small rental property or a stake in a business. After several years, that could easily become $40,000 or $50,000, enough to acquire something that produces another few $100s a month in cash flow. Now suddenly, the system begins to change again, because the income streams that we talked about in Movement 1 are no longer coming from work or creative side efforts. They are also starting to come from assets that were positioned in the past. And once that starts happening, a very powerful cycle begins to form. Income creates surplus. Surplus gets positioned into assets. Those assets begin producing new income streams, and those new streams can eventually be positioned again into the next asset. And when you step back and look at that process over 10 or 20 years, you begin to understand something that most of us never really get taught. wealth is not just about earning more money. It is about what happens to the money once it enters your life. Because the moment money stops sitting still and starts owning pieces of productive assets in the world, your financial life begins shifting from something you manage into something that slowly starts working with you and for you. And that's where the next force quietly begins to do its work. Time. Movement 4. Compounding over time. Once money begins moving into assets instead of just sitting in your bank account, something fascinating starts to happen. And it's something that most of us completely underestimate. Time starts working for you because assets that produce returns don't just grow in a straight line. They grow on top of what was already produced before. And that simple idea, money earning money that earns more money, is what people mean when they talk about compounding. Now let's make that very concrete. Imagine someone takes just $500 from that surplus we talked about in the previous movement, and just like before, invests it consistently every month into something like a broad stock market index fund. That's nothing exotic or speculative, just a simple, diversified investment that historically has produced around 7% of interest per year on average over long periods of time. Now, in the beginning, it doesn't feel very impressive. After the first year, that person invested $6,000, and the growth might only be a few $100s. It's easy at that stage to think nothing really spectacular is happening. But this is where time begins to do something very powerful. After 10 years, that steady investment of $500 a month could grow to roughly $85,000. That's already more than the $60,000 that were actually invested, simply because of the returns that have been working in the background. But the really interesting part happens when time continues. After 20 years, that same $500 a month could grow to somewhere around $260,000. Now suddenly, the growth itself is starting to become significant. And if that same pattern continues for 30 years, the account could reach roughly $600,000. At that point, something remarkable has happened. The person only contributed $180,000 of their own money over the 30 years. The rest, hundreds of thousands of dollars, came from the growth of the assets themselves. And if the same system keeps running for 40 years, that account could easily grow beyond $1 million. Not because someone made a brilliant trade, not because they took huge risk, but because they consistently positioned surplus money into productive assets and then gave those assets the one thing most of us underestimate: time. And when you really look at those numbers, you begin to understand why wealthy people think differently about money. They're not just asking how much they earned this month. They're asking what today's decisions might look like in 10, 20, or 30 years from now, once compounding has had the time to do its work. Because once assets start producing returns, those returns start producing returns on their own. And over decades, that quiet process can transform relatively ordinary financial decisions into something far more powerful than most of us imagine. And once systems like this start running in the background of someone's life for decades, this is where the conversation changes one last time. Because at some point, it stops being only about paying bills or saving for emergencies. it starts becoming about something much bigger. What kind of financial structure are you building over the course of your lifetime? And what might that structure eventually make possible for the people who come after you? Now, if a strategy like this keeps running for long enough, something very interesting starts happening. At first, those assets are just numbers on a screen. An investment account growing quietly in the background. Maybe a property slowly building equity. Maybe ownership in something that produces income. But over time, those numbers start turning into something much more concrete. They turn into options. Options to make decisions in your life that are no longer dictated purely by your next paycheck. Options to change careers, to start something of your own, to take a step back when life demands it, without feeling like everything will collapse the moment you slow down. And the longer a system like that runs, the more options grow. Because when assets have been compounding for 20, 30, or even 40 years, they eventually reach a point where they're not just supporting the person who built them, they are also starting to affect the people around them. Imagine someone who started building assets in their early 30s and kept on positioning surplus into investments over the course of their working life. By the time that person reaches their 60s, those assets might represent hundreds of thousands of dollars, sometimes even more. But the real impact isn't just the number itself, it's what that number allows. It might mean that their children can study without starting their adult life buried in debt. It might mean that a business someone spent decades building can continue creating income for the next generation. It might mean that opportunities exist that simply wouldn't have existed otherwise. And that's when the conversation about wealth stops being about numbers entirely. Because at that point, it's no longer just about income or savings or investment returns. It's about the structure you build during your lifetime. A structure where money doesn't just arrive because you worked this month, but where assets exist that continue producing value long after the original effort has been made. And when you zoom out and look at that structure over decades, you realize something that most people never really get taught. Wealth isn't created by saving money alone. Wealth is created by designing how money moves through your life. And that entire process begins with one simple shift that most of us never make. That building savings doesn't automatically mean building wealth. If this conversation made you think a little different about money, make sure you subscribe and turn on the notification bell, because in the next video, we're going to dive much deeper into the first movement we talked about today. How people actually start building multiple income streams in real life. Not in theory, but with very practical examples that show what this can look like. Thank you so much for being here, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye. Lord have mercy.